In economics, we talk a lot about markets. There's a market for pencils, a market for going to the doctor, a market for stolen artwork. Pretty much anything people want to exchange, a market exists for it. Now, markets have two sides. On the one side, we have people who want things, and on the other side, we have people who have things that they want to sell. And it's when these buyers and sellers come together to exchange that we have a market for things. So what do I mean by things? We can divide things into two categories. We have goods, which are tangible. We can physically touch them, like cars and clothes and cups of coffee. We also have services, which are intangible. They cannot be touched. Examples of a service might include guitar lessons. So perhaps there's a guitar player who would like to offer lessons, and maybe you have always wanted to learn how to play the guitar, so you're demanding guitar lessons. So when you and the guitar player come together, you have a market for guitar lessons. Other services could be hiring a lawyer or an architect or going to college. There's a demand for college education, and in fact, we are engaged in this very instant in that market. You are demanding a college education, and the University of Iowa is supplying that college education. So you or your parents are sending money to Iowa, and in exchange, you're learning. These are things that buyers and sellers exchange on the market, even though they're not tangible. We're going to start our analysis of markets with the buyers. We call the buyers the demand side because buyers demand things. And remember, microeconomics zooms into decisions that individuals make. So we're going to start with one individual person deciding how much they're willing to pay for a good or a service, which can also be thought of as how much will that person buy, how many units, how much of the good will they buy for a given price. Those turn out to be two interpretations of the same phenomena, as we'll see. So let's start with a simple example. Let's think about my personal demand for shoes. Shoes are on my mind these days because I have a new puppy. His name is Teddy. He's very cute. And his favorite hobby is eating shoes, which I hear is actually a pretty common hobby for puppies. Teddy is trying to eat my shoes, but he has not completely succeeded. But let's suppose that he did. Let's suppose Teddy has eaten all of my shoes, and so therefore I'm barefoot. I don't own any shoes. So now I'm going to do the following thought experiment. Given that I don't own any shoes right now, what is the most money that I would pay for my first pair? Not how much do I want to pay, but what is the absolute most I would pay? That's really hard to answer. So instead, I'm going to ask myself this: how much benefit will I get from having my first pair of shoes? And the answer to that is a lot. After all, we are in Iowa. This isn't Hawaii. It gets really cold in the winter, especially in those polar vortex winters. And I basically wouldn't be able to leave my house for months if I didn't have a single pair of shoes. Also, I have a job, and it's generally expected that we wear shoes at our jobs at the University of Iowa. Not to mention all those signs in the doors that say no shoes, no shirt, no service. So basically, I feel like I need shoes just to function in everyday life. So back to the question, what is the highest amount I'd pay for a pair of shoes? And that's kind of hard to answer, but I feel like it'd be $5,000 to be stuck in my house and not be able to go to my job. That would be such a deprivation. So let's say that my willingness to pay for that first pair of shoes is $5,000. So the next question in this thought experiment is, what is the most that I'd be willing to pay for a second pair of shoes? I already bought my first pair of shoes. Let's assume it's a practical pair of sneakers. And now I'm thinking of a second pair of shoes. So I asked myself, how much extra benefit do I get from the extra shoes? We saw that I got a ton of benefit from the first pair. Now I can go to work, I can leave my house during winter. My second pair of shoes won't bring me that much extra benefit. With a second pair of shoes, I could have maybe a pair of sneakers for everyday wear and a pair of dress shoes for work. So the extra benefit of an extra pair of shoes is being able to wear professional looking shoes to work. And that's an extra benefit for sure. I'd feel a little uncomfortable going around in dress clothes with sneakers, but it's not as much of a benefit as I got from my first pair of shoes that let me leave the house. So again, there's a big jump in happiness from being stuck at home, jobless, to having one pair of shoes and being able to leave home and go to work. And now there's a much smaller jump in happiness from wearing sneakers to work compared to wearing professional shoes to work. So how much am I willing to pay for the second pair of shoes? I'm going to say $200. So realize the extra benefit I get from the first pair of shoes is huge, and I'm willing to pay a lot, $5,000 for that first pair of shoes. The extra benefit I get from having my second pair of shoes is much smaller, and as a result, I'm also willing to pay much less. So let's switch to doing this in a chart so that we can keep track. Now we'll put all this information into a table. So just to fill in what we already have, my first pair of shoes would be sneakers, and I'd be willing to pay $5,000, which is a lot of money. My second pair of shoes, we'd said, would be dress shoes, so I could look professional at work. And that falls by a lot. I'm only willing to spend $200 on my second pair of shoes compared to $5,000 for my first. What would I get third? I think I'd get boots for those polar vortex winters. So how much benefit do I get from a pair of boots? Well, quite a bit, because it'll keep my feet warmer in the winter than the sneakers would, not to mention drier. On the other hand, it doesn't feel as big of a jump as being able to look professional at work. So maybe the most I'd be willing to pay for my boots would be $175. And then what would I get if I were to get fourth pair of shoes? I think I would actually get a second pair of dress shoes in a different color. So I could have my outfits coordinate a little bit better. How much would I be willing to spend for a second pair of dress shoes? So having shoes that match definitely brings benefit to me. On the other hand, not as much extra benefit as keeping my feet warm and dry in the winter. So I think probably I'd only be willing to spend $125 for the second dress shoes. And then lastly, if I were going to buy a fifth pair of shoes, I think I would get sandals. And for those, it's nicer to wear sandals in the summer than sneakers or dress shoes, for sure. Just as we get cold winters, we get hot summers here. On the other hand, that's not that big of a jump in benefit. So maybe I'm willing to spend $50 for that. So you can see that for every extra pair of shoes that I buy, my extra benefit is smaller. My total benefit is going up, right? I am happier with 3 pairs of shoes than only 2, but the extra happiness I get from my boots is $175, which is less than my extra happiness for the first pair of dress shoes. So now that we have all this information, we're going to do what economists do, and we are going to graph it. Now I've recopied all that information about the number of shoes, first, second, third, and the highest amount that I'm willing to pay for that pair of shoes. And now we're going to graph it. So the way to think about this is, what if shoes cost $6,000 per pair? How many pairs would I buy? And the answer is none. The highest amount I'm ever willing to pay for a pair of shoes is $5,000. So if it goes up to $6,000, I will just spend the winter at home and quit my job. What if, so here we're saying at $6,000, I buy 0 pairs of shoes. What if the price falls to $5,000? If the price falls to $5,000, we can look over here in the table and see that for $5,000, I'm willing to buy that first pair of shoes. I'm willing to pay $5,000, so if it costs $5,000, I'll buy 1. Am I willing to buy the second pair of shoes? No, I'm only willing to pay $200 for that. So only that first pair brings me enough extra benefit that I'm willing to pay the $5,000. So we'll mark that. So this says that at $5,000, I'm willing to pay, I'm just sort of marking these dotted lines, I'm willing to buy 1. So now I'm going to draw 2 little lines there to show this is not to scale. So if the price falls to $200, now how many pairs of shoes am I willing to buy? Well, at $200, am I willing to buy the first pair of shoes? Absolutely. And in fact, I'll feel like I'm getting a great deal. I'm willing to pay $5,000 and I only have to pay $200. Sign me up. So I will buy that first pair of shoes. and I'm just willing to buy the second pair of shoes as well. So if the price falls to 200, I'm willing to buy 2 pairs of shoes. What if the price falls to 175? So that's going to be sort of in between these two. And you can see that 175, I'm willing to buy the first, I'm willing to buy the second, and I'm also willing to buy the third. What if the price falls to 125? Now you can see I'm willing to buy 4. And if the price falls to 50, I'm willing to buy 5. What if the price fell to 0? And I didn't leave enough room in my graph here, but what if the price fell to 0? Would I buy infinite shoes? No. We assume in economics that even if the price is 0, that there's a finite amount that you would demand. And here I would say that that is limited by the amount of closet space I have. So we live in an old house, and back in the 1920s they did not believe in closet space. So I couldn't buy thousands of pairs of shoes for free because I couldn't fit them in my closet. So even if shoes were free, I would probably only buy 20 pairs of shoes. And even at that point, I'd be running out of room. So now we can connect all these dots and we have our first demand curve. So this is my individual demand curve. This is Professor Frank's demand for shoes, and it shows us for every price how many shoes I will demand. So what have we learned in this video? First, we learned that how much we're willing to pay for an extra piece of good depends on how much extra benefit we get from that extra piece of good. Second, we learned that the extra benefit we receive falls as we buy more and more. This is true of shoes, right? I said I was willing to pay $5,000 for that first pair of shoes because the marginal benefit of being able to leave my house was huge, but I'd only pay $50 for my 5th pair of shoes because at that point, the extra benefit of having separate shoes for the summer is much smaller. It's also true of, say, ice cream cones, right? So on a really hot day, that first ice cream cone tastes amazing. There is so much benefit. If you allow yourself a second cone, it probably still tastes good, but not nearly as good as the first cone. And if you choose to have a third ice cream cone, you're probably starting to feel uncomfortably full by now, and you're getting very little extra benefit at all. In fact, you might be getting negative benefit if you're getting a stomach ache. So your overall happiness is falling. And in fact, economists believe that this is generally true, that the extra benefit we get from an extra unit falls as we consume more and more. I'm going to look at that in a little more depth in another video. The third thing we learned then is we can take that information and we can graph how many units of a good a person is willing to buy for a given price and create an individual demand curve. We did that for my personal demand curve for shoes and showed that once we knew how much I was willing to pay for each pair, we could figure out, just kind of like turn it around and figure out how many shoes I'm willing to buy for a given price. And finally, we saw that that demand curve slopes down, that with higher prices we buy less, and with lower prices we buy more. And so demand has that negative slope, it slopes down. And that's actually a very important idea in economics. We call that the law of demand.